In the bustling streets of Beijing, tales of the paranormal are whispered but rarely witnessed. But among these stories, one tale stands out, gripping the city for decades. Known as the Phantom Bus 375, this story is unlike any other, filled with the lingering chill of a winter night, the mystery of missing persons, and a haunting revelation that makes even the most skeptical listener pause. For those aboard that bus in the early hours, only a select few live to recount the chilling details. The old man in our story, whose voice now shakes as he recalls that night, was one such survivor. The unseen shadows. It was the dead of night when I boarded bus 375, weary from a long day at the hospital. The city's noises had faded into a dull hum, and only the occasional car passed by as I stood at the bus stop, the air heavy with the scent of rain that had fallen earlier. I had never taken the bus at this hour before, but the wait for a taxi was too long and I was too tired to care. When the bus finally came into view, I was relieved. The usual driver, a middle-aged man I had seen countless times, sat in his seat, and I recognized a few passengers scattered across the bus. An elderly woman, a young man who always seemed to be dozing off, and a few others whose faces I didn't remember. I boarded, took my usual seat near the back and sank into the corner. The bus began its journey, a rhythmic hum that I had always found soothing. It was late and the streets of Beijing were deserted. The tall buildings lined the roads like silent sentinels, casting long shadows in the moonlight. The dim lighting of the bus flickered occasionally, but it didn't seem too out of the ordinary. That was until I noticed the temperature drop sharply. A coldness settled over the bus, creeping into my skin. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me, but the chill refused to fade. Something was wrong. I glanced around. The other passengers didn't seem to notice. They were staring straight ahead, their faces pale and expressionless. I looked out the window, but the world beyond was unfamiliar. We had left the main roads behind and now passed through empty streets that twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. The landmarks I recognized from my daily commute were gone. The streets were dark, the buildings run down. And then the bus lurched violently to the left, forcing me to grab the seat in front of me to steady myself. The man in the scarf. I wasn't the only one who felt something was wrong. Across from me, an elderly man in a thick scarf clutched the armrest with white knuckles. His face was pale, his eyes wide in a way that I hadn't seen before. I could see him trembling, but he said nothing. His lips were pressed tightly together as if trying to hold back something. He was staring out the window, his gaze fixed on the night. I wondered if he could see something I couldn't. Just as I was about to turn my attention back to the road ahead, the bus jerked again, this time harder. I looked up in time to see the driver's face in the rearview mirror. His expression had changed. His usual calm demeanor was replaced with sheer panic. He gripped the wheel with both hands, his knuckles strained and white. I watched him take a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but the tension was palpable. Then, without warning, the lights flickered again and the bus came to an abrupt stop. There was an eerie silence, and in that silence, I heard a faint sound. A whisper. It was distant at first, but it seemed to grow louder. The passengers around me remained motionless, their eyes vacant, as if they didn't hear it. But I could hear it. A low, guttural voice, too faint to understand, yet too familiar. The old man in the scarf turned to look at me, his eyes wide with fear. "We should not be here," he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't know what he meant. I didn't want to know. But just then, a chill ran down my spine and I knew that something was wrong, something far more terrifying than I could comprehend. The passenger in the window. The bus began moving again, but the path was unfamiliar. We turned down streets I didn't recognize, the buildings around us growing older, their windows shattered and doors ajar. The bus rattled, the sound of the engine a constant drone, but it didn't feel like the same bus anymore. The atmosphere was heavy, thick with an unexplainable sense of dread. The cold, too, had grown more intense. The young boy sitting near the window had started to tremble. His small frame was hunched forward, his hands tightly clasped in his lap. His eyes were fixed on the darkness outside, his expression one of deep fear. I couldn't help but stare at him, wondering what he could see that I couldn't. Then, in a whisper so faint I almost didn't catch it, he spoke. "Do you see them?" I looked out the window but saw only the darkness of the street. But I knew deep inside that whatever he saw, it wasn't of this world. I wanted to reassure him, tell him that there was nothing out there, but the words wouldn't come. I turned my attention back to the aisle, where the other passengers sat as though frozen. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They simply stared ahead, unblinking. Then I saw it. A shadow, tall and formless, moving against the flow of traffic, walking alongside the bus. It didn't make sense. It wasn't possible. But there it was, just outside the window, its form undulating with an unnatural fluidity. It was as though it was drawn to the bus, following us at an impossible pace. I gasped, but when I looked again, the shadow was gone. The driver's desperation. The driver's panic was now evident. His hands were shaking, his eyes darting from the mirrors to the road ahead. I watched as he muttered something under his breath, his voice trembling. But it was only when he slammed his fist against the wheel that I realized how dire the situation was. "We're too far," he said, almost to himself. "It's too late. We've crossed the line." His words hung in the air like a death sentence, and a sinking feeling in my stomach told me he wasn't referring to the bus ride. The bus began to accelerate faster than I had ever felt before. The engine roared, and the city outside blurred into a mass of lights and shadows. I looked around, but no one reacted. They all sat in silence, staring straight ahead. The old man in the scarf was still watching me, his eyes filled with an unspoken warning. And then the bus swerved sharply again, this time throwing me from my seat. I hit the floor hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. As I scrambled to get back up, the lights flickered and went out completely. The darkened bus. The world went pitch black. I heard nothing but the steady hum of the engine, the occasional screech of the brakes, and the sounds of the other passengers, soft murmurs, the shuffling of feet, and the subtle scratching noises from somewhere far off. But there was something else, something beneath the sounds that made my skin crawl. It was the feeling of being watched. I felt it before I even heard the soft scraping noise from above. It was as if someone, was standing over me. I turned my head, straining to see through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the empty aisles of the bus, the eerie silence. But then the whispering began. It was faint at first, like the wind blowing through cracks in the walls. But it grew louder, more insistent. And this time I could hear words. "Come closer." I looked around frantically. The other passengers remained unmoving, their eyes closed, as if in some kind of trance. I heard the whisper again, but it was louder now, more distinct. "Come closer. You're almost there." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to escape whatever this was, but I was rooted to the spot. I couldn't move. It was as if the darkness itself had taken hold of my body, immobilizing me with fear. And then I saw it. The figure was standing at the front of the bus, its face obscured by a veil of darkness. It was tall, its form tall and thin, almost skeletal. The air around it seemed to warp and twist. And its eyes, those eyes, glowing with a malevolent red light, stared directly at me. It reached out a hand, long and bony, and for the briefest moment I thought it was going to touch me. But just as it did, the lights flickered back on. The bus was no longer moving. The reality of the journey. When the lights returned, everything had changed. The walls of the bus were decayed, rotting wood covered in mildew and grime. The seats were torn and the floor was covered in dirt and dust. The windows were cracked, and the familiar sights of the city had been replaced by a bleak, barren landscape. The streets outside were no longer those of Beijing, but a place I couldn't recognize, desolate, empty, and silent. The driver was gone. The old man in the scarf was gone. The passengers? Gone too. The bus was now empty, save for the boy who sat beside me. But when I looked at him, I saw that he was no longer the same child I had seen before. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt, as though time had drained the life from him. And when he looked at me, there was no recognition in his eyes, only a cold, unsettling emptiness. "Why are we still here?" I whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The eyes of the lost. The bus was silent now, save for the soft hum of the engine that seemed almost to pulse with a life of its own. I looked around, but the world outside had changed. Gone were the familiar, bustling streets of Beijing. Instead, an empty landscape stretched as far as the eye could see, a wasteland of dilapidated buildings and overgrown streets. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay. No sounds reached my ears, no birds, no wind, no traffic. It was as though the world had stopped, leaving only the remnants of a forgotten city. I turned to the boy beside me, but he had drifted off again, his eyes closed as though he were sleeping. But I knew better. There was something off about his stillness, something unnatural. His chest didn't rise or fall as it should. There was no sign of life in him. The faintest whisper of a memory, something from long ago, fluttered at the edge of my mind, but I couldn't quite grasp it. I wanted to scream, but the fear lodged in my throat, silencing me. The bus began to move again, creeping forward at an agonizingly slow pace. The buildings outside seemed to warp as we passed, stretching and twisting in impossible ways. Some of the structures looked as if they had been abandoned for centuries. Others seemed as though they had never been inhabited. It was as though the very fabric of reality had unraveled, and we were now trapped in a place where the rules of time and space no longer applied. The windows rattled, and I glanced up at the rearview mirror. The driver's seat was empty. Panic rose in my chest as I scanned the bus. Every seat was vacant except for mine and the boys. The others, the passengers who had been with us at the beginning, had vanished. There were no signs of them, no discarded bags, no traces of their presence at all. It was as though they had never been there to begin with. The only evidence that anyone had ever boarded this bus was the strange, haunting sensation that still lingered in the air. My heart began to race. I tried to push the fear down, but it was impossible. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. And I knew somehow that the journey had only just begun. The gatekeeper. A sudden jerk of the bus made me look up again. The landscape outside had shifted. We were no longer in the desolate city. Instead, we had arrived at what looked like a massive gate, an archway that stretched high into the sky. The gates themselves were dark, ancient, and covered in strange symbols. I could feel the weight of their presence pressing against me, suffocating me. The bus came to a halt in front of the gates, and for the first time since this strange journey began, I heard something, a voice. Low, deep, and echoing, it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You've arrived," the voice said. "Welcome to the end." I didn't understand. What did it mean, the end? I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and when I turned, there was the figure standing in the aisle. The figure from before, tall and thin, its form still shrouded in darkness. It reached out a hand, its fingers long and bony, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. "Come with me," it said, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in my seat, unable to move. The creature's hand drew closer, and as it touched my arm, I felt an icy chill spread through my body, seeping into my bones. I knew then that this was no ordinary bus ride. No ordinary journey. It was something far more terrifying. The final stop. The creature's grip tightened, and the bus began to move again, this time heading straight for the gates. The air was thick and the pressure was unbearable. The gates loomed larger and larger as we approached. There was no escape now. I could feel the boy beside me stir, his eyes snapping open, wide with terror. He looked at me, but there was no recognition in his gaze. Only a blank, hollow stare. The gates were closing now, their massive doors creaking as they swung shut. The bus didn't stop. It didn't slow. Instead, it barreled forward, heading straight for the threshold. I could hear the sound of metal grinding against metal as the doors began to close behind us. And then, in that moment of overwhelming terror, I understood. We weren't on a bus. We were on a vessel, a prison, carrying the lost souls of those who had passed through the gates before us. The boy, the passengers, the driver, none of them had ever been real. They were all manifestations, shadows of the past, trapped here just like me. We were headed toward the end. The endless journey. The gates slammed shut behind us, and the world around us dissolved into a blur of darkness. The bus continued its journey, but there was no destination, no final stop. The landscape outside had vanished, leaving only a void. There was no up, no down. No time, no space. We were lost in an endless cycle, trapped between worlds. The boy had vanished, and with him, the last trace of humanity. The bus was empty now, save for me. And the figure that had been guiding us had become something else. It was now standing at the front of the bus, its face no longer hidden in darkness. I knew then that I had become part of this place, part of this endless nightmare. There was no escape, no going back. The figure turned its hollow gaze on me, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. It raised its hand, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to obey. And as I reached for the door, stepping into the abyss, I realized that the journey had only just begun for me. As the bus drifted further into the void, the last glimmers of the world it once knew faded away, leaving only a heavy silence and an endless dark horizon. For those few souls who boarded on that fateful night, there was no longer a way back. Trapped in an eternal journey through an unknown realm, they had crossed into a space where time and reality had unraveled, leaving them suspended between worlds. And as the final traces of humanity slipped from their memories, they became one with the shadows that lurked within the bus. A part of the legend of Bus 375, lost to all but those who dared whisper its tale in the quiet hours of the night. May those who hear of this story never find themselves on a road that leads to Bus 375, for some journeys have no return.